Today is a day about freedom. But the story of your freedom did not begin on June 19th, 1865. It did not begin in a cotton field in Texas. It did not begin in chains. It did not begin with an announcement that something that should never have happened had finally, 2.5 years late, officially ended. Your story of freedom is older than that. Older than America. Older than the slave trade. Older than every empire that participated in it. Juneteenth marks the end of something. This video is about what existed before that something began. Because before the chains, there were crowns. Before the auction blocks, there were thrones. Before the cotton fields, there were universities. And before anyone told your ancestors they were property, your ancestors were building some of the most sophisticated civilizations the world has ever seen. This is what Juneteenth doesn't tell you, and it is the most important part of the story. Let us go back. Not to 1865. Not to 1619. Further, all the way back to what your people were before the interruption. In the 14th century, while Europe was being ravaged by the Black Death, and most of its population lived in conditions we would today describe as extreme poverty, the Mali Empire stretched across an area larger than Western Europe. Its capital, Niani, was a thriving metropolis. Its ruler, Mansa Musa, controlled more than half of the world's gold supply. When he made his pilgrimage to Mecca in 1324, traveling with a caravan of 60,000 people, 12,000 servants, and 80 camels each carrying 300 pounds of gold dust, he distributed so much wealth along the route that he single-handedly crashed the gold market in Egypt and the Mediterranean for 12 years. Mansa Musa was not the exception. He was the product of a tradition of African governance, African scholarship, African economic power that had been building for millennia. The Mali Empire did not appear from nowhere. It grew from the Ghana Empire before it, which grew from trading networks and agricultural societies that stretched back thousands of years before that. Your ancestors were not waiting to be discovered. They were already building. And in the same century that Mansa Musa was reshaping the global economy with his pilgrimage, the University of Sankore in Timbuktu was operating as one of the great intellectual centers of the medieval world. 25,000 students. Libraries holding between 400,000 and 700,000 manuscripts. Scholars producing original work in mathematics, astronomy, medicine, law, and Islamic philosophy that was being read and referenced across Africa, the Middle East, and parts of Europe. This was your inheritance, not poverty, not primitiveness, not the absence of history. A living, breathing, documented legacy of intellectual, political, and economic achievement that the slave trade did not create. It interrupted. Frederick Douglass understood this. In 1852, he gave what many consider the greatest speech in American history. What to the slave is the 4th of July, in which he named the violence of celebrating freedom while millions remained enslaved. But Douglass also understood something deeper. He understood that the people being enslaved were not people without history. They were people whose history had been deliberately obscured to justify what was being done to them. Because you cannot enslave a people and simultaneously acknowledge their civilization, the erasure had to come first. It always does. The transatlantic slave trade did not begin because African people were primitive or without culture. It began because African people had something that others wanted: land, labor, knowledge, and resources, and because the ideology of race was constructed specifically to justify taking those things by force. Scholar Ibram X. Kendi, in his landmark work, Stamped from the Beginning, traces the history of racist ideas in America and shows definitively that racist ideas did not precede slavery. Slavery preceded racist ideas. The ideas were created to justify the system that already existed. Your ancestors were not enslaved because anyone genuinely believed they were less than human. They were enslaved because they were enormously valuable. And the story of their being less than human was the price of justifying that. Juneteenth is about the moment that system officially ended in the United States. But your freedom, your real freedom, the freedom of who you are and where you come from, was never the slave master's to give. It predated him by 20,000 years. Think about what that means for how you carry yourself today. The narrative that was built around slavery, the narrative of African people as without history, without achievement, without civilization, was a lie constructed for economic purposes. It was not truth. It was not even believed by the people who promoted it at the highest levels. It was a story told to justify a system. And Juneteenth, at its deepest level, is not just the anniversary of an announcement in Galveston, Texas. It is an invitation. An invitation to remember what was true before the lie was told, to reconnect with the civilization, the scholarship, the governance, the artistry, the mathematical thinking, the astronomical knowledge, the medical tradition that your ancestors carried for millennia before anyone put chains on them. The Mansa Musa who crashed the gold markets of the medieval world. The scholars of Sankore who produced 500,000 manuscripts. The architects of great Zimbabwe whose walls still stand without a drop of mortar. The physicians of the Nile Valley who wrote the word brain for the first time in human history. The mathematicians of Central Africa who carved organized notches into a bone 20,000 years ago and laid the foundation for every equation your children will ever solve. These people were not freed on June 19th, 1865. They were your ancestors, and they were already free. Juneteenth marks the end of one chapter. But your story did not begin with that chapter. Your story begins 20,000 years ago on the continent that produced the first human beings, the first cities, the first universities, the first mathematical objects, the first written descriptions of the human brain. Your story begins in freedom. It was interrupted. For a brutal, unconscionable period of time, it was interrupted. And then, on June 19th, 1865, the interruption officially ended in America. So today, celebrate. Celebrate the courage of the people who survived. Celebrate the resilience of those who kept culture and language and love alive under conditions designed to destroy all three. Celebrate the official end of the most sustained assault on human dignity in modern history. And then remember what was there before the assault began, because that is the full story of Juneteenth. Not just what ended, but what was always there, waiting to be remembered.